How could I go about connecting with others when every effort was so unsatisfying? What did I actually enjoy or care about? Around people, I felt I had to censor every natural reaction and pretend to have interests and feelings that were normal. Plus, people were so overwhelming. They were all so loud and erratic, their eyes like painful laser beams boring into me. All I wanted to do was sit in the dark and not be bothered or judged. I believed something was fundamentally wrong with me. I seemed to be broken in ways I couldn't explain, but which everyone else could see at a glance. I spent several more years languishing like this, working myself to the point of burnout, having emotional breakdowns, relying on romantic partners for social contact and a sense of worthiness, and Googling things like how to make friends in the middle of the night. Through it all, I never considered asking for help or sharing with anyone how I felt. I lived by a very narrow set of rules, and remaining independent and invulnerable was chief among them. The more I read about autism, the more things began clicking into place. I had always been overwhelmed by loud sounds and bright lights. I got inexplicably angry in crowds. Laughter and chatter could make me blow up with rage. When I got too stressed out or became overcome with sadness, I found it hard to speak. I'd hidden all of this for years because I was certain it made me a joyless, unlovable asshole. Now I was beginning to wonder why I believed such awful things about myself. Autism was my newest obsession, a thing I couldn't stop reading and thinking about, but I'd had many other special interests in the past. I remembered being passionate about bat-watching and horror novels as a kid. Children and adults alike had chided me for being too weird and hyper about those interests. I was too much in so many ways. To other people, my tears were immature tantrums and my opinions were condescending diatribes. As I grew up, I learned to be less intense, less embarrassing, less me. I studied other people's mannerisms. I spent a lot of time dissecting conversations in my head, and I read up on psychology so I could understand people better. That was why I'd gotten a PhD in social psychology. I had needed to carefully study the social norms and patterns of thinking that seemingly felt natural to everyone else. After researching autism privately for about a year, I discovered the autistic self-advocacy community. There was an entire movement led by autistic people who argued we should view the disability as a perfectly normal form of human difference. These thinkers and activists said our way of being wasn't wrong at all. It was society's failure to adapt to our needs that left us feeling broken. People like Rabbi Rudy Reagan, author of the blog Real Social Skills, and Amethyst Shaber, the creator of the Neuro Wonderful video series, taught me about neurodiversity. I came to recognize that many disabilities are created or worsened by social exclusion. Armed with this knowledge and a growing sense of self-confidence, I started meeting autistic people in real life, posting about autism online, and attending local meetups for neurodiverse people. I found out there were thousands of autistics just like me who discovered their disability in adulthood after years of confused self-loathing. As children, these autistic folks had been visibly awkward, but they were mocked for it instead of given help. Like me, they developed coping strategies to blend in. Things like staring at a person's forehead to simulate eye contact, or memorizing conversational scripts based on exchanges they saw on television. Many of these stealthily autistic people fell back on their intellect or other talents to gain acceptance. Others became incredibly passive because if they toned down their personalities, they wouldn't have to risk being too intense. Beneath the inoffensive professional veneers they'd developed, their lives were falling apart. Many of them suffered from self-harm, eating disorders, and alcoholism. They were trapped in abusive or unfulfilling relationships with no clue how to feel seen or appreciated. Nearly all of them were depressed, haunted by a profound sense of emptiness. Their entire lives had been shaped by mistrust in themselves, hatred of their bodies, and fear of their desires. I noticed that there were clear patterns in which kinds of autistic people succumb to this kind of fate. Autistic women, transgender people, and people of color often had their traits ignored when they were young, or have symptoms of distress interpreted as manipulative or aggressive. So did autistic people who grew up in poverty, without access to mental health resources. Gay and gender nonconforming men often didn't fit the masculine image of autism well enough to be diagnosed. Older autistics never had the opportunity to be assessed because knowledge about the disability was so limited during their childhoods. These systematic exclusions had forced an entire, massive, diverse population of disabled people to live in obscurity. This gave rise to what I am now calling masked autism, a camouflaged version of the disorder that's still widely neglected by researchers, mental health providers, and autism organizations that aren't led by autistic people, such as the much reviled Autism Speaks. When I use the term masked autism, I'm referring to any presentation of the disability that deviates from the standard image we see in most diagnostic tools and nearly all media portrayals of autism. Since autism is a pretty complex and multifaceted disorder that covers a lot of different traits, which can manifest in many different ways. I'm also talking about any autistic person whose suffering wasn't taken seriously for reasons of class, race, gender, age, lack of access to health care, or the presence of other conditions. Usually it's white boys with conventionally masculine interests and hobbies that are flagged as potentially autistic when they're young. Even within that relatively privileged class, it's almost exclusively wealthy and upper-middle-class autistic kids who get identified. That group has always been the prototype for autism when it's described by clinicians or depicted in media. All the diagnostic criteria for autism are based on how it presents in this group. Every autistic person is hurt by this narrow conception of the disorder, even the white, rich, cisgender boys who are most likely to be reflected by it. For far too long, we've been defined only by the hassle that white autistic boys cause their well-off parents. Our complex inner lives, our own needs and sense of alienation, the ways that neurotypical people confused, confounded, and even abused us, were all ignored for decades because of this lens. We were defined only by what we seemed to lack, and only insofar that our disabilities presented a challenge to our caregivers, teachers, doctors, and other people who held power over us. For years now, psychologists and psychiatrists have discussed the existence of female autism, a supposed subtype that can look a lot milder and socially appropriate than male autism does. People with so-called female autism may be able to make eye contact, carry on a conversation, or hide their tics and sensory sensitivities. They might spend the first few decades of their lives with no idea they're autistic at all, believing instead that they're just shy or highly sensitive. In recent years, the public has slowly become familiar with the idea that women with autism exist, and a few excellent books like Janara Narenberg's Divergent Mind and Rudy Simone's Aspergirls have worked to build awareness of this population. It's also helped that high-profile autistic women like comedian Hannah Gadsby and writer Nicole Cliff have come out publicly as autistic. There's a significant problem with the concept of female autism, though. It's a label that doesn't properly account for why some autistics mask their autistic qualities or have their needs ignored for years. First, not all women with autism have the female autism subtype. Plenty of autistic women visibly self-stimulate, struggle to socialize, and experience meltdowns and shutdowns. Autistic scientist and activist Temple Grandin is a great example of this. She speaks in something of a monotone, avoids eye contact, and even as a young child craved sensory stimulation and pressure. Though she's very visibly and typically autistic by today's standards, Grandin was not diagnosed until adulthood. Although we're accustomed to thinking of grown-ups as more mature than their children, what if some sensitive children come into the world and within a few years are more emotionally mature than their parents, who've been around for decades? What happens when these immature parents lack the emotional responsiveness necessary to meet their children's emotional needs? The result is emotional neglect, a phenomenon as real as any physical deprivation. Emotional neglect in childhood leads to a painful emotional loneliness that can have a long-term negative impact on a person's choices regarding relationships and intimate partners. This book describes how emotionally immature parents negatively affect their children, especially children who are emotionally sensitive, and shows you how to heal yourself from the pain and confusion that come from having a parent who refuses emotional intimacy. Emotionally immature parents fear genuine emotion and pull back from emotional closeness. They use coping mechanisms that resist reality rather than dealing with it. They don't welcome self-reflection, so they rarely accept blame or apologize. Their immaturity makes them inconsistent and emotionally unreliable, and they're blind to their children's needs once their own agenda comes into play. In this book, you'll learn that when parents are emotionally immature, their children's emotional needs will almost always lose out to the parents' own survival instincts. Myths and fairy tales have been depicting such parents for centuries. Think of how many fairy tales feature abandoned children who must find aid from animals and other helpers because their parents are careless, clueless, or absent. In some stories, the parent character is actually malevolent, and the children must take their survival into their own hands. These stories have been popular for centuries because they touch a common chord. how children must fend for themselves after their parents have neglected or abandoned them. Apparently, immature parents have been a problem since antiquity. Growing up in a family with emotionally immature parents is a lonely experience. These parents may look and act perfectly normal, caring for their child's physical health and providing meals and safety. However, if they don't make a solid emotional connection with their child, the child will have a gaping hole where true security might have been. The loneliness of feeling unseen by others is as fundamental a pain as physical injury, but it doesn't show on the outside. Emotional loneliness is a vague and private experience, not easy to see or describe. You might call it a feeling of emptiness or being alone in the world. Some people have called this feeling existential loneliness, but there's nothing existential about it. If you feel it, it came from your family. Children have no way of identifying a lack of emotional intimacy in their relationship with a parent. It isn't a concept they have, and it's even less likely that they can understand that their parents are emotionally immature. All they have is a gut feeling of emptiness, which is how a child experiences loneliness. With a mature parent, the child's remedy for loneliness is simply to go to the parent for affectionate connection. But if your parent was scared of deep feelings, you might have been left with an uneasy sense of shame for needing comforting. When the children of emotionally immature parents grow up, the core emptiness remains, even if they have a superficially normal adult life. Their loneliness can continue into adulthood if they unwittingly choose relationships that can't give them enough emotional connection. They may go to school, work, marry, and raise children, but all the while they'll still be haunted by that core sense of emotional isolation. This passage really did it for me. Emotional loneliness is so distressing that a child who experiences it will do whatever is necessary to make some kind of connection with the parent. These children may learn to put other people's needs first as the price of admission to a relationship. Instead of expecting others to provide support or show interest in them, they may take on the role of helping others, convincing everyone that they have few emotional needs of their own. But unfortunately, this tends to create even more loneliness, since covering up your deepest needs prevents genuine connection with others. Lacking adequate parental support or connection, many emotionally deprived children are eager to leave childhood behind. They perceive that the best solution is to grow up quickly and become self-sufficient. These children become competent beyond their years, but lonely at their core. They often jump into adulthood prematurely, getting jobs as soon as they can, becoming sexually active, marrying early, joining the service. It's as though they're saying, since I'm already taking care of myself, I might as well go ahead and get the benefits of growing up fast. They look forward to adulthood, believing it offers freedom and a chance to belong. Sadly, in their rush to leave home, they may end up marrying the wrong person, tolerating exploitation, or staying in a job that takes more than it gives. They often settle for emotional loneliness in their relationships because it feels normal to them, like their early home life. This is a publication by Kathy Wassel and Emily Burke of the Autistic Girls Network. It was published this year in January of 2022. And it is single-handedly one of the most important pieces of information in the past 2 years of my discovery journey that I reference often. I've had the tab open on my phone for a year and a half at this point, so I really want to share this with you all. Let us begin. The topic of autism and girls has been much discussed in recent years, but while many are aware that girls may present differently, there is widespread misunderstanding about exactly how. This is a huge issue because autistic girls, and those who present in the same way, are being missed, and outcomes for autistic females are particularly poor. Official statistics still say that 1 in 100 people in the UK are autistic, but these figures are out of date. Official US figures from the Centers for Disease Control now say 1 in 44, but this is based on 8-year-olds, and as we all know all too well at Autistic Girls Network, many people are diagnosed as autistic after the age of 8. Official figures in Northern Ireland are 1 in 22, so all we can really say with certainty is that there are more than you think. This is not because autism has become more prevalent, but because it has become better recognized. Girls in the UK are still being diagnosed autistic on average 2 to 3 years later than boys, though. Given what we are coming to understand about the damage a late diagnosis and subsequent camouflaging of autistic traits can do to an autistic person's mental health, confidence, and self-esteem, this is a statistic which needs to change fast. But girls aren't diagnosed later because there is a female phenotype of autism. There isn't. They are missed for complex reasons, the largest of which are masking and presenting internally. What do we mean by that? When we talk about an external presentation of autism, we mean one that's probably more recognizable to the majority of people, where the person behaves in a way which is visibly different to their non-autistic peers. They might stim, move, perform an action, or make a noise in a repetitive way by rocking or flapping their hands. They might be non or minimally speaking. They might exhibit distressed behavior. As a generalization, children brought up as girls don't tend to present that way as much, but some do, and if they do, they're probably diagnosed earlier. Their autistic traits, and those of some boys and non-binary young people, are camouflaged and internalized to help them fit in with their peers, which can be a conscious or unconscious decision to avoid the stigma of being autistic. However, masking comes with a high cost in terms of mental health and keeping a strong sense of identity, and it's no coincidence that children and young people who present in an internal way are being diagnosed autistic at the time, and because they have reached breaking point. This is going to be a multi-part series, so stay tuned for parts 2 through 500. This is part 2 of the Autistic Girls Network publication, Autism, Girls, and Keeping It All Inside. Let's go. Autism has to be diagnosed by behaviors, but unfortunately these behaviors often end up being those of traumatized and distressed autistic people who only stop internalizing them when they're at the breaking point. Autistic children who present in an external way will be noticed and referred early, partially because they're causing disruption in school, and the school is invested in helping that disruption to stop or be more controlled. Autistic children who present in an internal way tend to behave much more passively and tend to be ignored. They're not causing a disruption, so the added incentive isn't there for them to be referred, and frequently the signs aren't spotted until mental health has deteriorated to such a point that behavior becomes more externalized and disruptive, albeit disruptive in a different way. But until we can start to recognize autistic children who present in an internalized way while they're still in primary school or before, we won't break the cycle of lack of knowledge about internalized presentations, and these people not appearing in research because they're not yet diagnosed. The diagnostic process is less likely to favor those brought up as girls, especially when there is no intellectual disability present. The ratio of girls to boys is 1 to 2 for autistic people with an intellectual disability, whereas it's 1 to 3 in those without. The assessment tools used for diagnosis and research in the field of autism have almost always been developed from research using predominantly male samples. Girls and women need to be struggling more than male peers to get a diagnosis, and on average it takes 2 to 3 years longer. In the UK, there is a wide geographical difference in how likely girls are to be diagnosed. Some areas have a ratio of 1 girl to 30 boys, while others have a ratio of 1 to 2. This isn't just a statistical anomaly, rather a difference in how diagnostic teams recognize autistic girls. There is research suggesting that more women are referred for diagnosis as adults than men, which implies that more girls are being missed. Bias. The history of autism diagnosis is also biased toward males. Neither Leo Kanner nor Hans Asperger, who might controversially be considered the founding fathers of autism diagnosis, paid much attention to girls. Kanner also considered autism a condition of childhood only, and dismissed those who did not conform to his rigid criteria, a subset who subsequently came to be diagnosed with Asperger's. Even now in autism research, we are still dealing with some of the leftover unconscious bias from the 1950s. And when you consider that it generally takes 17 years for research to start changing things in real everyday life, we still have a long way to go. Sadly, pioneer Lorna Wing identified in 1981 that there was a gap in diagnosis of autistic women, and this has still not been rectified. This is part 3 of the publication by the Autistic Girls Network, Autism, Girls, and Keeping It All Inside. Let's go. Really important in the diagnosis of any autistic person, but especially tweens and teens who have already experienced years of knowing they were different to their peers, is that the diagnosis is presented in a positive way, in contrast to the medical model of deficiency, and is accompanied by experienced autistic voices and the formations of a positive autistic identity. The young people themselves need to be given agency to have some control over this process. Our diagnostic pathway in the UK is a long way from this ideal now. Processing differences. We couldn't complete this paper without touching on the subject of autistic inertia. You may already know about executive dysfunction, but we prefer not to use the dis words like disorder, dysfunction, and all the other pathologizing language that surrounds autism. To understand autistic children, you really need to understand autistic inertia and monotropism. By monotropism, we mean someone is funneling, probably unconsciously, most of their attention into one thing, which can lead to what you might know as special interests. But we'd like to open your mind to the idea that there's nothing weird or out of the ordinary about these interests. They're just strong interests, and it's no more odd to be interested in, for example, flags of the world or K-pop stars, than it is to be interested in a game which involves some players being paid very large sums of money to kick a ball around a field of grass. Some football fans have very strong interests in their favorite teams. We don't call this a special interest. However, for an autistic person, their topic of passionate interest forms what Fergus Murray calls an attention tunnel. The great part of cognitive processing is funneled into barreling your way along that attention tunnel. And this is where the inertia, having difficulty stopping and starting activities, comes in. Because if you're having a lovely time processing stuff about a topic you love, it's not a welcome intrusion to be pulled away from it. Murray rather beautifully puts it, quote, "Thinking in terms of inertia also gives some insight into the discomfort of being interrupted or plans changing. It's as if we've loaded a cart to the brim with thoughts and feelings, and then we suddenly have to steer it around a sharp corner." End quote. Other changes, like transitions, can also be deeply disconcerting for autistic people, and that includes all the ones you don't realize are autistic yet, and cause a feeling of control being lost. Demand avoidance and meltdowns are a reflection of a truly bewildering lack of control, of frustration at being misunderstood, even at the same time as being accused of misunderstanding others. So autistic inertia makes transition difficult, and also accounts for a delay in processing. Because when the brain has allocated the bulk of processing load to your interest of choice, there's not much left to deal with. Interruptions. Sorry, I lost my place there. I'm going to stop here. Stay tuned for part 3. Part 4! Have you ever had a doctor dismiss your pain and symptoms at every turn? It almost is unbelievable. It can leave you feeling completely helpless, and could also lead to you beginning to question yourself. Well, surely it can't be that bad, right? Welp. Don't call me Shirley. Boo. I'm going to read this to you. In just about every aspect of the world, male bodies have always been the default, from office air conditioning to crash test dummies. But nowhere is that default more dangerous than in medical research. Women are diagnosed significantly later than men on average across over 700 diseases, and in some cases waiting up to 10 years for the right diagnosis. We're more likely to die from heart attacks, react poorly to prescription drugs, and have our pain and symptoms dismissed by doctors. All of this is rooted in a simple but shocking fact. In the United States, women were not required to be included in clinical research until June 10th, 1993, when Congress passed the NIH Revitalization Act. I was a year and a half old when this act was passed. That means that much of modern medicine is built on research performed exclusively on male bodies, and the effects of this research gap are serious and sometimes even deadly. Ignoring the differences in male and female bodies not only sabotages further research, but it also means that scientists have often applied findings from male-only research to women as well. After all, aren't women just small men? No, the fuck we're not. Centuries of unconscious bias and lack of research have created a public health crisis where women are often dismissed, misdiagnosed, or prescribed the wrong treatment. It's a perfect storm of implicit bias in clinical settings, a dearth of women's health research, and a lack of funding for female-focused solutions. This article was released on the 29th anniversary of that act passing. Yeah, but get this shit. The exclusion of women from clinical research was partly a safety measure as a result of the use of thalidomide to treat morning sickness in pregnant women in the 1950s, unknowingly causing thousands of birth defects. So instead of researchers taking it upon themselves to figure it the fuck out, they just decided to exclude women from their research. Even though thalidomide was never approved for use in the US, after what happened, researchers thought it was safest not to include any woman of childbearing age in their studies. However, researchers also had biased concerns that female hormone fluctuations made women too difficult to study, and that including females made research more expensive. Because of those reasons, women of childbearing age were actively excluded from all clinical research for almost 30 years. Congress wrote the NIH inclusion policy into federal law through a section in the NIH Act of '93 entitled Women and Minorities as Subject in Clinical Research, largely thanks to the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues. The law finally stated that cost was no longer an acceptable reason for excluding women from clinical trials. Wouldn't you fucking know it? I'm almost out of time, so stay tuned for part 2 where I finish reading this infuriating article. Part 2 of one of the most infuriating articles I have ever read. The NIH Revitalization Act of 1993 didn't change things overnight. The 2015 review concluded that progress has been slow and halting, and we have not achieved sufficient progress in order to truly serve the public health. To help rectify this, in 2015 the NIH introduced a policy requiring medical researchers to take sex into account as a biological variable. Now, anyone who applies for grant funding from the NIH must take into account males and females in the development of research questions, study design, data collection, analysis of results, and reporting of findings, or give compelling reasoning for why only one sex should be examined. This doesn't mean we've received equality in research. We're a long way from fixing the serious consequences of centuries of medical exclusion. To this day, we don't truly know how women metabolize and react to many medicines, why some adverse reactions are more common in women, nor how women experience or manifest pain. The efficacy, dosage, and side effects of many drugs were never tested on women. Research published in 2020 from several thousand medical journal articles found clear evidence of a drug dose gender gap for 86 different medications approved by the FDA, including antidepressants, cardiovascular and anti-seizure drugs, and painkillers. This is fucking crazy. The study found that medications are routinely overprescribed to women because the clinical trials were conducted only on cisgender men, and women also experienced worse side effects in 90% of cases. The study also concluded that this sex difference was not explained by sex differences in body weight. These mysteries continue to exist in part because the research gap doesn't just involve female humans, it also affects preclinical research. Drug development begins with in vitro testing and animal trials, and even today, almost all initial research used only, you guessed it, male cells or male animals. Studies show that most in vitro studies are carried out on male cells, and a 2005 review found that 79% of pain studies used only male mice. And if you're looking for good news, this is not the article for that. Closing the gender health gap starts with investing in research on the female body, yet only 4% of healthcare research and development spending in the US goes directly towards women's health. 4%. A recent study concluded that a disproportionate share of resources is applied to diseases that affect primarily men at the expense of those that affect primarily women. Overall, twice as much funding goes to male prevalent diseases compared to female prevalent ones. Without equal research, there can never be equal care. We need to increase women's participation in clinical research, not only as trial participants, but also as study researchers. Duh! All women in venture teams are 35% more likely than all male teams to focus on women's health. If women had been equally represented between 1976 and 2010, there would have been over 6,000 more female-focused inventions. That would explain why male reproductive care uses the latest and greatest space laser technology, and women's reproductive health care uses 19th century farming equipment. It's because of Dr. Bernadine P. Healy that this 1993 policy became law. Glamour UK, June 2022. Medical misogyny is causing a mental health crisis among autistic women. 22% of autistic women are hospitalized because of their mental health by the age of 25. Charlotte Colombo, the journalist who covered this story, speaks about her personal experience in the top paragraph, but the last sentence is interesting. When have women ever been taken seriously by doctors? A 2019 study found that 52% of women believe that gender discrimination negatively impacts their medical care, while nearly a third of women said they felt a need to prove the legitimacy of their medical concerns and symptoms for their doctors. The writer is also autistic, and she speaks about her own difficulties for over a decade of having to prove her health to doctors. Tatum Spears, 30, hi, that's me, recently went viral on Twitter after sharing her own story of medical misogyny on Twitter, with her thread, which recounts her experience of being dismissed by a male psychiatrist over autism being viewed over 2 million times. I'd expressed my suspicions to my psychologist once before, but was dismissed by him, with the psychologist claiming that I couldn't be autistic because I was socially engaged in the phone call and didn't speak in a monotone voice. I was crushed beyond belief. His invalidation and dismissal devastated me. But I persevered. Over the course of 8 months, I read peer review articles, learned about autism, took nearly a dozen assessments, and they all said the same thing. They said that these assessments weren't meant to serve as a diagnostic tool, but if the results are consistently high, I should mention it to a medical professional. So I did. Multiple times, and this led to being refused an assessment again. His reasons for this were based on a rigidly incomplete and unforgiving symptom list that sounded like it was from the 1990s. When I explained to him that the reason I had enhanced communication skills was because of my performing arts experience, I have a degree in vocal performance, extensive therapy, and an advanced reading age, hyperlexic, he responded by suggesting that I had narcissistic personality disorder. That wasn't his professional opinion, that was his personal opinion, because the way he worded it was entirely uncalled for. He said, maybe it's narcissism, maybe you're a narcissist. Like, sir, why do you sound like one of my jilted exes? Aren't you supposed to be a professional? 50% of autistic boys are diagnosed before age 11, and only 20% of autistic girls are diagnosed before age 11. And even when we are identified as autistic, we gain support and diagnosis significantly later than autistic males do. For instance, I found all of this shit out about me at age 29. Because autism is so intrinsically rooted with masculinity, with countless researchers even peddling the theory that autistic people have an extreme male brain, it seems like all autistic boys have to do to get diagnosed is be socially awkward and extra good at maths. Meanwhile, research shows that autistic girls' traits need to be extra pronounced, even more so than autistic boys, to be recognized and even considered for a diagnosis. And this causes girls to be excluded for meeting an impossible threshold for them because it's incomplete and inaccurate. I'm running out of time, so I urge you to visit the link tree in my bio and read the rest of that article. Because user nonsensical alphanumericals, your insider info is at best myopic and at worst misogynistic. This is no big secret. Listen to any of the women in your life describe their experiences like this with you. Insider info, if you want to have women in your life, you probably should view them as people first. To wrap it up, sir, and isn't it always, your gaslighting has been declined. I only accept PayPal, Venmo, and Cash App. Last month, I had the honor of being interviewed by Deanna Pistono, who studies at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism in Phoenix. Earlier this week, the article that I was interviewed for was released, and I would love to read it to you. Published in Cronkite News on March 6, 2023, above all else, believe us. Advocates say doctors can show biased behavior toward autistic adults. Doctors often show bias toward autistic adults, showing skepticism about their autistic identity, using ableist language, or failing to recognize autistic people may react differently to sensory stimuli, like pain, activists say. This leads to distinct challenges for autistic adults and the need for patients to advocate for themselves and activists to drive systemic changes. Tatum Spears, that's me. What the fuck was that? Tatum Spears, 31, remembers a psychiatrist who refused to acknowledge the possibility that she was autistic. He proceeded to call me a narcissist, and I was like, okay, this man is not interested in hearing me at all, Spears said. And he wasn't. Autistic adults may also, as autistic life coach Heather Cook points out, experience or show pain differently from non-autistic adults. This may make it difficult for doctors to accurately perceive an autistic person's pain or state of mind. My outward signs of what my inward signs are often mismatched, said Cook, 41. I might actually be in a great deal of pain, but look still very calm and collected, and doctors will often not believe me. Zoe Gross, 32, director of advocacy at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network in Washington, D.C., said doctors sometimes assume all people feel pain in the same way. I feel like doctors often run on autopilot, and it normally works for them because many people have a similar understanding. If you take 10 people with heartburn, maybe all of them will have similar symptoms, but then if you throw in an 11th autistic person who has heartburn, it's going to be totally different for them, end quote. The lack of knowledge or respect can lead to lesser quality of care. A study published in Molecular Autism in May 2022 said autistic adults reported poorer quality health care than non-autistic adults. Another 2022 study published in Spectrum surveyed autistic and non-autistic people primarily living in the UK or Ireland. Only 1 out of 3 autistic people said they had a good relationship with their general practitioner. 1 in 3. Medical care in the U.S. is rife with misunderstandings, advocates said. Autistic people may be troubled by sensory stimuli, such as the glare of fluorescent lights or odors from cleaning products and medications. It's a fight to just stay focused, Cook said. Now I've started asking, can we turn the lights down or off? And most of the time they will actually do that. But I never knew until recently that I could actually try that. Different facets of an autistic person's identity also may affect their ability to advocate successfully. Women may be disbelieved or thought to be exaggerating their pain. Cook recalled only being tested for ovarian cysts after she collapsed in the doctor's parking garage. Only then did she find out that she had cysts, and one of them had burst. For queer and gender diverse autistic people, their gender or sexuality may have a larger impact than their autism on their medical treatment. It would be literally unsafe to disclose that I'm a lesbian, said Anita Cameron, 57, a longtime disability activist and director of minority outreach at Not Dead Yet, a disability rights group. You literally get treated different. It's a little safer to be autistic than to be a lesbian, to be queer these days, said Cameron, who lives in Rochester, New York. Autistic people are 6 times more likely to be trans and non-binary. Cameron, who is Black, added that Black autistic people may be perceived as threats due to others misinterpreting their behavior as dangerous. She notes the deaths of Black people with developmental disorders and encounters with police, making her careful of how she presents herself to health workers even while living with chronic pain. If I go up in that emergency room crying and screaming, at the very least I'll get mocked, Cameron said. At the very worst, I will be escorted out of the emergency room or even arrested. Activists and experts said one problem is that much of the research and public attention on autism centers on children rather than adults. The CDC estimated the population of autistic adults at 5.4 million in a 2020 study, which is 2.2% of the adult U.S. population. More people are starting to be aware that autism doesn't magically go away when you turn 18, Zoe Gross said, but there's still this idea that autistic adults are childlike back in some way. Doctors may fail to treat autistic adults as equals, using ableist language or infantilizing them, advocates said. This can go as far as denying them treatment or procedures commonly offered to others. For example, medical providers may not ask questions about autistic patients' sexual health and relationships. The treatment gap means autistic people have to advocate for their health needs, being insistent about their need for accommodations, scripting and practicing what they'll say in medical offices, and when necessary, making formal complaints. Nothing will ever change if you just allow things to happen to you and do not speak out on it, said Cameron, who in March 1990 helped organize and participate in the Capitol Crawl, an act of civil disobedience that helped to spur the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act 4 months later. During the crawl, more than 60 disabled people left behind mobility aids and crawled up 83 steps to the Capitol building. Cameron describes participating in the event as having been, quote, crawling in history. Decades later, systems still need to change, advocates said. Medical professionals need to listen to recommendations from disability advocates, step out of autopilot to explore the needs of autistic patients, and be willing to make accommodations. It starts at the core of the doctor-patient relationship. Believe us, Spears said. Above all else, believe us. I wept for hours after I read it the first time because I didn't understand the breadth and the depth of what this article would cover. And it was written beautifully. Deanna's a fantastic journalist. And the fact that I was included, my voice and my story were both included in an article with the likes of Heather Cook, who is a fantastic autistic life coach, Zoe Gross, the director of advocacy at Autistic Self-Advocacy Network in DC, and Anita Cameron, who helped organize and participate in the Capitol Crawl. It literally changed history. And my mind is still trying to wrap my head around being included with these phenomenal advocates and activists for disabled people and for autistic people. This article is so important to me because of the way I've been made to feel my whole life, that my problems were just a me problem. And then when I find out as an adult that they're not problems and that I'm not a bad person or lazy or broken, I'm different, I'm autistic. And autism has answered every question throughout my life that I didn't even know that I had. Questions about my innermost internal experiences that I never voiced out loud until I saw people on this app and on Twitter voicing their experiences out loud, and those being almost identical to mine and blowing my mind. So thank you if you stuck around for this whole video. I know it's a long one, but this is really important to me, and I'm sure to a lot of you too. So this article is in my Linktree under interviews and features. It's the top one. And also if you'd like to catch up and read my Glamour UK article from last year, that's on there too. Thank you for listening, and please believe us. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for voicing this. This comment hit me right in the feels. It's because of these brave and creative autistic ADHD creators on this app and on Twitter and YouTube and everywhere that I was able to piece together my own puzzle. And the more information I learned along the way, the more I felt compelled to share and to speak out about my innermost experiences that I've never shared with anyone. Fast forward to now, and here we are, and I can't words about this. I am immensely grateful for this full circle moment that anything that I've shared, anything at all, has resonated with anyone at all. And I am honored to be a part of your discovery journey. And I'm thinking of all the creators who came before me who are a part of my discovery journey. I'm so glad that I'm able to pay it forward like this. And I encourage anyone who is just now discovering their neurodivergence to pay it forward and share what you've learned and what you will learn along the way, because these facts and these revelations are literally life-saving. Thank you all so much for everything. And thank you for allowing me to be my truest self and to share my truest self with you and to allow my words to resonate with you.